everyone. So I will preface this by saying that it's a bit unusual, of course, to be doing the gold finals motion. For the very simple fact that obviously only two teams got to debate this motion. Full disclaimer, I didn't watch the debate. Uh, it probably was a fairly riveting debate. I don't even know who won, or which teams were in it, but it was the final, so it had to be fairly riveting. What I will do, however, is focus just a little bit more on if this came out as an impromptu motion. I think it's a fairly common impromptu motion in some tournaments, in some places around like overseas. And I think the focal point is not necessarily, what's the maximum amount of research that you can pull to like completely outstrip and outframe your opponent. But just like how do you unpack this motion in a way that gives you a fighting chance, right, on either side if you receive it in the future tournament, the future round. So let's start with some basic stuff about this motion and like my first thoughts when I first saw this motion. First thought I had, can it be done? Like is it actually possible to do it? Like how far away are we from actually being able to colonize a planet? We've sort of stalled in our space race, like our space exploration programs in recent years. So NASA lost a lot of funding, and also like we haven't really been exploring other planets. We also don't really have the technology to survive on those planets. Things like terraforming a planet to make it livable doesn't quite currently seem to be on the table for humanity. So I think one question that I immediately thought of was, can this actually be done or not? And is it a question of just giving it more time and throwing more resources at it, or is this kind of insurmountable challenge for humanity? I think the other question that I had was colonize for what? So like, are we thinking about leaving, right, Earth and sort of going to other planets to live? Is this sort of like a backup policy for Earth and for humanity as a whole, which is what like Elon Musk has always been talking about, right? Like the idea that you kind of want to make sure that humans on two planets or more planets, so that if one planet goes to kaput, the other one will still be around. Or is it more like for resources, sending minerals, sending natural resources back to Earth that might be lacking right now on our planet? I think either one's possible. Obviously one seems to be a bit easier than the other. But it ends up being interesting because these two things have different levels of like how realistic it is, right? It's probably more realistic to be able to like ship stuff back to, from Mars to Earth potentially, like resources and stuff. It might not be as realistic to live on Mars, although some would say it's actually more realistic because that's a one-way trip, whereas it might be quite hard to have a two-way trip, from Earth to Mars and back. So that's a fairly interesting debate, or rather two fairly interesting angles to take this debate. I don't think there's a need for a team to choose, but obviously I think based on strategy, you might pick one over the other as like the primary reason why you're colonizing a different planet. And the last question, like the last burning question I had was who would fund all of this? It could be the UN. Does that actually say that it should be other countries funding so it could be a global body. It could be individual countries. Although that comes with its own set of potential implications. For instance, space race in the Cold War. The idea that if a country gets access to all of Mars's resources, does that make them the next global superpower? So there are interesting ideas about whether individual countries should be allowed to just go all out, right, on the space race. Obviously, right now a lot of this funding happens privately, through private companies, private individuals, people who try to make a quick buck off of space exploration. This obviously cannot be the debate, right? Like, you cannot be saying, hey, by significantly fund, we mean private individuals significantly fund. Presumably, you have to look at it from the perspective of the state of our global body, and also because private companies significantly funding space exploration is already the status quo. So given that prop must defend a shift from the status quo, it probably has to be the first two rather than the third one. But it's important context nonetheless that right now, private companies do fund space exploration in general. So these are the things that sort of are swirling through my mind, right? As I see this motion. Again, like, I wish I could tell you why I had these thoughts over other thoughts. I will say a lot of it just comes from the wording of the motion. So when I look at it, I'm just thinking attempts, colonize, these are big words, other planets as well. Like, it's a very specific thing, right? It's not just space exploration in general, it's literally other planets. So that narrows the debate a little bit, right? And from all of that, I'm just thinking about, what is the core of the debate? What is the thing or the mechanism that we are exploring in the first place? And that's why I end up having these questions. I think these are just good grounding questions to start a discussion from. When I received this motion, the first thing that I thought was that this intuitively I sort of bought opposition's case a little bit more. And for most debaters, you kind of have this natural intuition when you receive a motion. Like, you either like one side more, or you like the other side more. And then that's how, coaches tell you, oh, this motion is weighted in this fashion or that fashion. The reality is sometimes motions are weighted, sometimes it's just literally like your internal biases. For me, my internal biases sort of lean towards the opposition in this debate, right? I thought, like, this seems a really unrealistic thing, right? Why are we spending so much money trying to build a biosphere on Mars? And so I think, regardless of where your intuitions naturally lie, a really good first step for understanding the debate is just to go with the natural intuition first. So if my natural intuition start with op, even if I'm on Guff, just flesh out the intuitive op case. So what's potentially the intuitive op case? One, that lots of money will be needed to do this, right? Obviously, money is a very abstract concept. One of the big problems with economics debates is that no one can actually figure out why economics matters or why money matters. So I think having how much, even like how much money is being used. So I think having better illustrations about the scale of the resources that we need, how much we actually need to pull in for this endeavor to even be realistic, right? And for this debate to be valuable, is, I think, an important thing for at least the opposition to bring up, right? You probably need to say that this is going to be a crap ton of money that we're going to need. Otherwise, there's no point even investing it in the first place. Because, like, if this technology is going to appear in 400 years' time, like, the Earth is probably going to be destroyed by then. So, that's something that you want to sort of just characterize, that you need to put a lot of money into this endeavor, right? And you want that to be the case because you want to say this money can be better placed elsewhere, or there are higher chances of success if you do other things with it, right? So that's something that you need to probably do in this debate. Just be like, you can't just spend like 100 billion on this. You can, but you won't go anywhere in the next 100 years, 150 years. And especially since it's a prep round, you can probably throw in some explanations as to why. Just give the facts, give the trend of how fast technology is evolving and why it's very unlikely that terraforming technology will be available by the time that we need it. On top of that, I think chances of success is quite important also, sort of interrelated, right? Like, depending on the objective, you can probably like poo-poo on how likely it is that we succeed. Elon Musk was talking about dropping nuclear bombs on Mars in order to terraform it. I'm just I'm very hesitant about whether that will work or not. I think there's a lot of things you can say intuitively that make a judge go, yeah, yeah, like I don't think, I'm not sure this is really gonna work, like so especially if you're gonna talk about like the creation of a biosphere, to actually have a civilization on Mars, to have a civilization somewhere else in a different galaxy, like these are sci-fi things that don't work in the real world. It's not really that possible for us to engage in terraforming. Um, and if it's about resources, bringing resources back, you know, how long is that gonna take? Um, for us to like how much do we have to invest in it for us to even get to a stage where we can send a rocket to Mars, have it land in Mars, and then fly back with the resources. Um, so I think that's an interesting thing to develop. I do think, of course, that if the debate becomes about resources, there are many more things to say than chances of success. Like if Gov focuses on a resource debate, Op can just be like, this is really, really bad. Like geopolitically, this sort of race to the bottom, this arms war of space is really, really bad. Um, so I would say that the chances of success mechanism works better for the creation of a biosphere. Whereas if the debate is about resources, I'll focus a lot more on like, hey, this like you don't want governments to focus their attention on this. You don't want governments to think, hey, like if Xi Jinping is spending all his money on space exploration, I have to do the same because if he gets to Mars first, then like I'm gonna lose out on my status as the world's foremost superpower. Right. So I think there is this claim about potentially creating an arms race. If you end up significantly funding this endeavor, even if Gov argues that, hey, the UN will do it. Realistically, right? Realistically, individual countries will undercut the UN and try to get a strategic advantage to themselves anyway. So there is probably a geopolitical argument there that, if everybody just agrees that this is not something that should be done, we have like conventions and laws in place to prevent, the colonizing of Mars, the way that we have for Antarctica, for instance, um, that's actually a good thing. It stops governments from engaging in this sort of, I won't say tragedy of the commons. It's more like a race to the bottom, like because it's a prisoner's dilemma, right? Because somebody else is engaging in like massive space exploration technology, I have to do the same as well. And then we all spend money where we don't need to spend money. I think the most important thing for opposition to consider is the trade-offs, right? So like you have to move the needle in favor of your preferred opportunity cost. What might that be? Solving climate change could be a big one. If you can mechanize out why that money is mutually exclusive, why is it that states would focus more on climate change in the absence of space exploration, which by the way is probably quite tricky to mech out. Like that requires a good mech, probably to do with like the fact that there's public demand for climate change policies could be one. The fact that you are running out of resources on Earth and you know there's no other solution because you can't go to Mars, that means that you're focusing more on green technology because that's actually renewable. I mean, I don't think these makes are by themselves winning, but I think you need to have a lot of them in order to explain why the opportunity cost is actually between like climate change, for instance, and space exploration. The other thing you can do if you want to narrow the debate down significantly, just be like, hey, we can do space exploration, just not colonize other planets. Like there's plenty of things that we can do in space. Like countries are looking at things like satellite technology, because that can really help with their own efficiency, with their economic growth, right? People are looking at for instance, how to utilize, how to get rid of space debris. All of that, is space exploration that doesn't involve the colonization of other planets. In theory, you can potentially go down the route of to be like, look, private enterprises are already doing a lot of good work in space, to get like to improve our knowledge of space, to improve the way that in which we interact with space. Therefore, we don't need governments to focus on this. Governments should focus more on things that concern the everyday people because they're using taxpayers' money. private explorers that want to make a quick buck out of space exploration and the creation of space technology can do so already in the status quo. That's better. That's like a better model overall. I think all that can potentially be said. And sort of just bring in the model of like private enterprises and how they have an incentive to engage in space technology, right? Developing space technology, even in the absence of colonization. And therefore, the government should focus on the more short-term pressing issues that actually affect current living people. And then you probably need to do some weighing, right? Like, why is it that people right now who are in poverty matter more than person who isn't born yet, who might suffer the devastating effect of climate change? There are plenty of like philosophical positions on this, like why intergenerational responsibility doesn't exist. I'm not gonna go into that because that will take literally the next half an hour. But you can go and research like why is it that we may not actually owe a duty to future generations. Um, there's some stuff there that could be interesting to consider as well. Just go and Google it. I'm sure you'll find some stuff. So government may know all of these things, right? Like I said, you may not know all these ideas in great detail, but if you think that op is more intuitive, surely you will have come up with some of these arguments already. And vice versa, if you think gov is more intuitive, you come up with some gov arguments already. The key then is to like frame your own case to at least be able to deal with or sidestep a number of the issues from the opposing team. So if you notice the way that I crafted the op case, it really sidesteps a number of issues that I think Gov would raise. I'm going to do the same for the Gov case, responding to op as well. So I think one interesting argument on the Gov side is the issue of necessity. So do we need to get started on this right now? So as Elon Musk said, this is sort of long-term insurance on Earth. It ensures our survival as a human species in case something catastrophic happens to the Earth. And so like it's worth investing in, even if there are short-term needs, because if we only ever focus on the short term and we don't think about the long term, then when the time comes, when the long term becomes a short term, it is too late, right? Like we literally will have no way of inventing a biosphere in like 50 years. We need that runway of 150, 200 years in order to have that kind of long-term insurance. You probably want to frame the money that you have as like that you're spending as like not more than like climate change mitigation technology, but enough to get like sort of grease the gears of the innovators, grease the gears of the scientists, give them resources that they can utilize, right, to develop better technology, to move things a little bit faster. Probably the example here is the space race, right, in the 1960s, where like just because we engaged in the space race doesn't mean that we didn't like spend a lot of money in Vietnam, right? We still did, but we still spent a particular portion of GDP on the space race. So the idea here is governments can have many different concerns at once, some that are long term, some that are short term, and you do not necessarily have to compromise on climate change, for instance, in order to have some money going towards spacefaring technology. Probably also bring in the frame of like what's that word? Diminishing marginal returns, right? So the more money you spend on something, the less you can actually get out of that money, because the issue might be that the technology is not ripe enough yet. So you can spend a lot of money on climate change, but it may not necessarily be an efficient use of money because the technology hasn't caught up with the amount of money that you're pouring into it, which is why it's best to diversify, right, resources across different ways of saving humanity, different ways of saving the planet. Probably a good argument also about resource management on Earth, like the fact that we're running out of resources, the fact that we do need, and I think here scale is really important. Like with an entire other planet of raw minerals, it's a really big deal, right? And I think you can make a big argument out of that in terms of just like reducing the resource constraint here on Earth, like making things much cheaper for poor people on Earth because they're no longer fighting for resources with the rich. There's a lot of potential claims here that can be quite useful for the government team. So that's one thing, right? Like this is really, really good. It's good to invest in space. The second thing is it's better for governments to be involved. versus the alternative of private corporations. Here, I think there is a very reasonable claim to be made that, hey, look, if Elon Musk is going to get to Mars anyway, like, we better get in on this act, because it'd be very, very problematic to leave space exploration in the hands of private capitalists, um, especially if they can get a claim over these resources first. So if the private sector is already spending so much money, and they're likely to end up getting to space first, and they're likely to claim resources for themselves, we might as well be involved in government funding. We might as well work with them so that this resource ends up being at least shared or controlled partly by governments and by people, right? By the people who voted in these governments, as opposed to solely by private individuals, by private corporations that may not have the interests of like the people in general at heart. I think this is a smaller argument, right? But I think it can be an interesting mitigation against the alternative that opposition provides of private corporations, private individuals. And I think also just bringing into account the spillover effects, like how does this benefit Earth? So it's an exciting new industry that means that plenty of people want to invest in it, versus like climate change, which is kind of like old, like beaten down, like everybody's kind of sick and tired of climate change. So the amount of money that is invested into climate change prevention technology is probably less because there's no enthusiasm for it. Space is something that you can get investors involved in, you can sort of coordinate investment opportunities for, and there could be good spillover effects, right? The creation of the ballpoint pen, creation of like satellite technology that we all rely on today requires us to have had a presence in space. And so you can make the fairly reasonable claim that if we did spend a lot of money on the space race and continuing the space race, that could result in many spillover benefits towards Earth as well. So I think these are all things that government can potentially say, right, to kind of like win the debate. So what would then be the deciding factor, right? Like, let's say both teams run their optimal cases. And I think if both teams run their optimal cases, things would, like, it will all boil down probably to analysis. And I want to focus on two things that I think would end up deciding the debate. The first is short-term versus long-term weighing, right? I think this is very, very clearly an important part of the debate. Both teams must acknowledge the trade-off. Like, there has to be a trade-off to either side. There has to be a trade-off to spending billions, hundreds of billions on space exploration. But I think one thing you probably want to do is just minimize the trade-offs. So number one, just mitigate, structurally mitigate. Don't just say that, hey, this happens to your side too. Like, actually minimize the trade-offs, actually explain to me why these trade-offs are minimal, but then where there are trade-offs, win the trade-off battle with intuitive claims about what matters more to humanity, right? So for instance, like, do we have an intergenerational responsibility to protect the lives of future individuals versus the responsibility of people today? Because people today will probably never get to see the benefits of this space technology, but the people in the future might have an insurance policy against like devastating climate change. What matters more? The scale or the type of harm that's caused on either side, right? Like, what is the difference in degree? What is the difference in kind of harm that both teams must absorb? Why is that difference important? Why is it that you are comparatively better than your opponent? I think if both teams run the correct case, this ends up being a crucial determining factor. So probably in the last like 20 minutes of prep, you want to spend time with your reserves, like, especially you're in third speaker, right? Just spend time with your reserves going like, hey, can we like pull out like 3 or 4 reasons why we win the trade-off battle? You will know what the trade-off is. You're third speaker, you should know this, right? So spend time with the reserve, figuring out like what are some intuitive lines you can run to win trade-off battle. The second thing I think would be really, really important in this debate is the mechanization of premises. And I think that like both teams would be at risk of running very far-fetched claims. And if that ends up being the case, what might win the debate is literally just like, did you give analysis for the claims that you are making? Was your analysis better than the analysis given by your opponents? So for instance, a very intuitive claim from Gov, and I'm also going to give you one example, is that colonizing space is necessary for humanity's long-term survival. Their first premise could be, hey, we don't have much time right now. Second, we should care about not having enough time. Consequently, hey, we need to go. We need to leave. Space core is the best way to leave, and funding space core is the best or only way to achieve space core. Conclusion for our survival, we should colonize space. These are fairly intuitive premises. But the question here is, are you able to actually mechanize each one for me to actually believe each of these premises? I'm not going to go through the whole argument. I think this argument, if you are able to mechanize it, makes sense. If you're not, it's literally riddled with assertions. All four premises are assertive in this particular argument. Yet it's probably one of the linchpin arguments for prop. So, for instance, right, if let's say your premise is we don't have much time, which is the first premise, one mechanization you can give is the cumulative disaster probability. So Stephen Hawking basically said the chance of a natural disaster destroying the earth or like really hurting humankind in the next year is basically zero. But if you stretch it up to the next 100 years or the next 1,000 years, it eventually basically becomes like 1, right? It goes from 0 to 1. So if we know that at some point there will be a disaster at some point in the future, even if we don't know when it might be, it is important for us like to recognize that we don't actually have that much time. Even if it might seem like we have 1 year or we have 10 years, cumulatively, we don't actually have that much time. If you're thinking of time scales of hundreds of years, we don't have that much time. Also, we should care about surviving, right? Why do we care about humanity's survival? Why do we care about the well-being of humanity? Things like, for instance, our natural empathy towards wanting to minimize suffering, our moral intuitions towards wanting to avoid suffering for other people, the fact that we just have natural proclivities towards like understanding other human beings, the fact that we care about our children and our grandchildren, and the legacy we might leave behind as an individual for the future. These are things that people care about, whether for selfish or selfless reasons, and so consequently, we should care about surviving. I'm not going to complete the argument for you, because that's not my job, right? But I want to just show you that instead of just saying these things, which are very easy things to say, honestly, what might make the difference between winning and losing this debate is how far can you mechanize your premises for all your different arguments. Because I think the strongest claims on both sides are both fairly fairly convincing, which means that the battle, especially in WSDC, might just literally go down to who does better analysis. So be careful about that. Have that mechanization in each of our premises. It might actually be worth it to just literally list your premises down first, and then start working on proving each premise once you list each one down. So yeah, that's my debrief for this particular round. I hope you had a productive session listening to my voice, as much as we can have anyway. And I'll see you on for the next one.